Welcome to Owl Books. If you like audiobooks,
subscribe my channel for more amazing content and hit the bell icon for updates.
Topic: the book Mini Habits Part 2: How Your Brain Works. I am a brain, Watson. The rest of me is a mere appendix. Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, The Adventure of the Mazarin Stone. In this chapter, I've taken the liberty of slicing the brain up into two different entities, the subconscious brain and the conscious brain. The brain is far more complex than that with many parts, but for our purposes, this is sufficient. Let this next point seep into the deepest depths of your mind and lodge there permanently. Never forget this: repetition is the language of the subconscious brain. The goal in creating habits is to change your brain with repetition. But the brain will resist changes unless they reward it handsomely. So really, the two keys to habit change as far as the brain is concerned are repetition and reward. It will be more willing to repeat something when there is a reward. Have you ever driven a car without power steering? You have to turn the wheel several rotations just to get a small response from the car. Our brains respond to change like cars without power steering. Each iteration results in a negligible difference, but repeated consistently, these small alterations can create a big change in your brain and your life. Your subconscious brain loves efficiency. This is why we have habits. When you repeat a behavior over time, your brain learns to automate the process. It's more energy efficient to automatically do something than to manually weigh your options and decide to act the same way every time. When you make a decision very quickly, it is probably from habit, even if you think you're actively deciding. In a way, you made the decision a while ago. Choosing your favorite ice cream flavor is one example. Slow changing, stable brains. The human brain is slow changing and stable. It has routines and a framework that allow it to respond consistently to the world. Having a slow changing brain is frustrating at times, but overall, it's highly beneficial. Imagine if your personality and life could transform overnight, you would go crazy. Once you successfully develop new healthy habits, everything becomes easier. You can get up, eat your healthy breakfast, and go to the gym every morning automatically instead of conducting a drawn-out battle with your brain. You can do the right things with little effort. For many, this feels like a daydream. They only know the dark side of stability, how the brain compels them to eat junk food, watch TV, smoke, and bite their nails. But good habits are as amazing as bad habits are dreadful. I know exercise is a habit for me because my identity has changed with it. It would feel odd and unsatisfying in a "that's not me" kind of way if I didn't go to the gym a few times per week. Last year, however, my identity was as a person who did just enough to stay in average shape. Both scenarios emerge from habit. Since 45% of our behavior is automatic regardless of what we do, we might as well make it beneficial to our lives and goals. In order to do that expertly, we need to understand the two primary players in the brain. A stupid repeater and a smart manager. Most of your brain is stupid. Well, not yours specifically. A certain part of every human brain is stupid, in the sense that it doesn't consider lung cancer while you smoke or the perks of great abs before you exercise. Worse, this is the strong part of your brain that usually gets its way long term. It recognizes and repeats patterns until told otherwise. It's called the basal ganglia. There is another section of your brain, however, that is really smart. It's called the prefrontal cortex and it's located behind your forehead. It's the manager that understands long-term benefits and consequences, and thankfully, it has the ability to override the basal ganglia. It handles short-term thinking and decision-making too. Just now, we've covered the two critical tools involved in habit change, the basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex. I like the way psychologist Dr. David Knoll differentiates the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain. Just now, we've covered the two critical tools involved in habit change, the basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex. I like the way psychologist Dr. David Knoll differentiates the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain. He says that everything except the prefrontal cortex determines what is, and the prefrontal cortex focuses on what could be. The only way to create habits is to teach the rest of your brain to like what the prefrontal cortex wants. The prefrontal cortex is what resists chocolate cake if at all possible, wants to learn French, wants to be fit, and would like to write a book someday. It's the conscious part of your brain that you'd identify as you. But the problem is that it tires out easily. Perhaps more accurately, because its functions are so powerful, it's an energy hog that tires you out. And when you tire out, or are stressed, as we covered, the repetitious part takes over. The basal ganglia isn't conscious or aware of higher-level goals that are unique to humans. But it is an efficient pattern repeater that saves us energy. So while it may not be intelligent like the prefrontal cortex, it is an incredibly important part of the brain. And once we train the basal ganglia to do positive behaviors automatically, we're really going to love it. This is the system we all have to work with. It sounds poorly designed at first, as the smart prefrontal cortex has less stamina than the thoughtless, repeating basal ganglia does, but it's actually brilliant when you know how to work it. How do clever weaklings ever overcome their dumb, strong counterparts? I'll give you a hint, it's not through brute physical force. I'm sure you already know that, perhaps because you are now recalling the failed attempts of your conscious mind to control your subconscious mind by brute force or willpower. The answer, of course, is to employ smart strategies to overcome the prefrontal cortex's natural weaknesses. The prefrontal cortex, your defense against automated behavior. In order to understand the prefrontal cortex better, we're going to look at what happens when it's gone. How does a brain operate without one? Not well. The upcoming study shows what the prefrontal cortex does, as well as what the rest of the brain does. When you remove something, you can see the impact of what it did and also how the parts operate without its influence. François Thermite was a French neurologist who examined patients with damaged frontal lobes. What he found in the following study was evidence that the brain's operation changes drastically without its manager, the prefrontal cortex, which is part of the frontal lobes. There are two groups of interest in Thermite's study: people with damaged frontal lobes and people with healthy frontal lobes. In the experiment, the subjects would sit across from an examiner, who asked interview-style questions. The examiner's task was to display indifference to the interviewee, refuse to respond to their questions, and occasionally perform random and puzzling gestures. He'd thumb his nose, give a military salute, fold paper and put it into an envelope, chew paper, sing, tap his leg, whimper, and more. Ha! Science is fun, NY. Here's what they found. Healthy lobe people, as one would expect, found his behavior odd. In purely scientific terms, the response was, "What's wrong with this dude?" Many of the younger participants laughed. And when asked if they thought to imitate him, they said, "No, not at all." But here's where it gets very interesting. Almost all people with frontal lobe damage did imitate the examiner's absurd gestures. They imitated him with great precision and without fail. For example, the men willingly urinated on a wall in front of others without any hint of surprise or concern. When they lacked the ability to imitate him exactly, such as not having paper to fold or chew, they were said to find ways to compensate perfectly. From the study, when interviewed after an examination, all damaged lobe patients could remember the examiner's gestures and, when questioned as to the reason for their imitative behavior, replied that because the examiner had made the gesture, they felt they had to imitate him. On being told that they had not been told to imitate the gestures, their answer was that obviously since the gestures had been made, they must be imitated. After being told not to imitate, most patients displayed the same imitation behavior. Those with damaged frontal lobes couldn't help but imitate the interviewer even when asked not to. With damaged frontal lobes, it appears people lose the ability to override decisions over their subconscious mind. The subconscious is almost like a different entity, a machine. Also interesting is that the normal participants forgot some of the gestures of the examiner, but those with damaged frontal lobes remembered every single one. This suggests that the presence of healthy frontal lobes, which again, contain the essential prefrontal cortex, steals some of our focus away from subconscious pattern recognition and can inhibit or initiate behavior. This is why we call it the manager. It oversees automated operations and steps in when it sees something that could be done better. Now for the flip side, what happens when it's the basal ganglia that isn't functioning properly? The basal ganglia, your pattern detector. Your brain's basal ganglia is technically a group of nuclei that act as a single unit, and plays a central role in habit formation and procedural learning. But research also indicates that the brain's many systems interact with each other in complex ways, and the basal ganglia can't necessarily be isolated as being the habit part of the brain. 11 Neuroscience, while helpful, cannot completely explain exactly how the brain works. That's not to say it's deceitful or inaccurate, but rather a small glimpse into a big mystery. The brain's workings are so intricate and complex that modern science still has a lot to learn. That said, knowing the basal ganglia is the main player in habit formation is useful. When combined with experience, experimentation, and good sense, our limited knowledge of the brain's workings is a powerful ally for personal growth. Thermeet's study on people with dysfunctional or damaged frontal lobes showed us the importance of the executive function of the brain, which can prevent us from robotically doing undesirable things. But what happens when it's the basal ganglia that's damaged or functioning improperly? There's a study on that too. It suggests that a damaged or malfunctioning basal ganglia causes you to lose your ability to have any habits. Researchers gathered people of 3 classifications: healthy people, Parkinson's disease patients, and those with memory problems. Parkinson's disease patients are those whose brains struggle to deliver the neurotransmitter dopamine to the basal ganglia due to cell death. This causes dysfunction of the basal ganglia. Participants were given 4 cards with random shapes on them, and asked to predict whether each card meant rain or sunshine. It would be very difficult to consciously form relationships between the cards and results, but there was a subtle pattern that could be picked up subconsciously. There were 50 trials, and after about 10 trials, both normal participants and memory loss participants gradually improved their guessing percentage from 50% to 6,570%. Their subconscious mind picked up the patterns that suggested rain or sunshine. The Parkinson's disease participants, however, did not improve from 50%. Without a healthy basal ganglia, their brain couldn't detect patterns, and thus, it would be hard for them to develop new habits. From these studies, we can see the brain as, in vastly oversimplified terms, a two-part system of executive decision-making and pattern recognition for automated behaviors. The management functions of the prefrontal cortex can be dynamic and responsive, but they use up a lot of energy and willpower. The automation functions of the basal ganglia are effective and efficient. They save us energy and take care of tasks that don't need constant monitoring. This leads into the next important consideration: how do we get ourselves to do things consistently with these two brain components? Before a behavior becomes habit, the two ways to get yourself going are motivation and willpower. Before you read this next chapter, say your final goodbyes to motivation, because you're not going to need it anymore. Thank you. Please share and give feedback.